Thank you for joining. My name is Scott Algeier. I'm the Executive Director of the Information Technology ISAC. I'm also a member of the Planning Committee for this conference, so I want to thank you all for joining us. I have the pleasure of moderating this session on the ICT, Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. It's a great pleasure to be talking with the three co-chairs of that task force. And we'll do introductions to each of them. So John Miller is with the ITI. He's one of the industry task force chairs. Robert Mayer with USTelecom is one of the other industry task force chairs, and Bob Kolaski with CISA is the government chair of the task force. So we'll kick things off. Robert, if you wouldn't mind going first, and just a quick introduction and any welcoming comments you might have.
Sure. Thank you very much, Scott, and welcome to the participants here. So I think this is another opportunity for the co-chairs of this task force. We've been working together since 2018. It's now been almost 3 years, and I think it's been one of the most successful projects with regard to demonstrating the value and the effectiveness of the public-private partnership. So I'd make a couple of points on that. So the task force has 60 voting members, 20 from the IT sector coordinating council, from the IT sector, 20 from the communications sector, and 20 from the government. And I believe, Bob, that there are as many as 12 government agencies who participate in the task force. So it's a 16-member voting body. The really amazing, or the basis for success is that because of the variety of participants in the ICT ecosystem, we get perspectives from all the different aspects of the digital infrastructure world, cloud, software, ISPs, bringing all of their perspectives and experience to this project. Over the course of 3 years, we've had as many as 300 participants, including subject matter experts on a variety of projects that you're going to hear about today. I think having a consensus-driven body that we've created here has been remarkably helpful in terms of building trust and developing, relationships that can provide meaningful input quickly. So you'll hear that we, for example, were involved in an analysis of the COVID-19 implications on supply chain. You'll hear about the work that we're doing on executive orders through the supply chain, responses to SolarWinds, a variety of things that just came up, and the body, being a standing operating body, was able to convene very quickly. And then we've also done work through what's called the Tiger Team, where we've engaged industry and government in an understanding of all the various supply chain initiatives underway. And I think that's been helpful in broadening the understanding of supply chain, and also ensuring that we understand the lanes of the different participants and do our best to avoid duplication. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. So John, would you like to introduce yourself and any welcome comments?
Sure. Yeah, and thank you, Scott, and also thank you, OASIS Open and the National Council of ISACs for the invitation to participate today. As Scott said, my name is John Miller. I'm Senior Vice President for Policy and General Counsel at ITI, which stands for the Information Technology Industry Council. We are a trade association representing 80 of the world's leading technology companies, and I lead our trust data and technology policy team, including our cybersecurity and supply chain security work globally. I have also been honored to serve for the past 2+ years as one of the three task force co-chairs, representing the IT sector and the IT sector coordinating council. I don't want to repeat everything that Robert said about the value of the task force, but it really is significant that in whatever it's been, 2.5 or so years, we have collectively built the task force into the preeminent public-private partnership on this critical issue of supply chain security and risk management. which not only continues to be a top priority of the organizations I represent, ITI and the ITSCC, but I know of the tech sector as a whole, the communication sector, and frankly, industry writ large, as well as the government, and not only the government here in the United States, but globally. It's been supply chain security has been certainly an IT sector priority for decades, but over these past couple of years, supply chain security has emerged into really a top tier global policy issue. It's resulted in an explosion of supply chain policymaking initiatives, certainly across the U.S. federal government, including multiple executive orders over the past 2 administrations. Robert alluded to the fact that we'll get into those a little bit later, but also really global policymaking initiatives, which is not surprising given what we are talking about when we talk about the ICT supply chain is a global supply chain. We've also, as well as working on those EOs, the task force, obviously the life of the task force overlaps with another significant event for everyone, which was the COVID pandemic. And we also had some dedicated work to kind of study the impacts there. The bottom line is, I think the formation of the task force as a forum for public-private collaboration on this issue has certainly been timely. It's incredibly important, and I know that we continue to urge, and I think have been successful in essentially establishing the task force as the center of gravity for policy making on this important issue in the U.S. So looking forward to the conversation. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, John. And Bob, over to you for an introduction, and then, if I may, ask you to we'll kick off the conversation with your after your introduction as well. So please introduce yourself, your role at DHS, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Sure. Happy to, Scott. It's great to be with you, and John and Robert, of course. We spend a decent amount of time together and have over the last few years working on challenging issues facing the nation's critical infrastructure and cyber and supply chain concerns, and appreciate your leadership of the IT-ISAC, the other work of the ISACs, which, really the ISACs as a whole have become so much more important to the nation's critical infrastructure solutions, getting information in the hands of network defenders and other security officers. Let me introduce myself. Bob Kolaski. I'm an assistant director at the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and I run the National Risk Management Center, and as you've heard, co-chair the ICT Supply Chain Task Force. The National Risk Management Center is a planning and analysis and collaboration center that brings together government, industry, government across the interagency at multiple levels of government to go after the most pressing strategic risk management challenges facing the nation's critical infrastructure. It is not a surprise, therefore, that we spend a lot of time on this issue. And zooming out for a second, as John was just doing, the challenges to our ICT supply chain, the risks, to use the lexicon, of course, you're going to hear from me, are related to the fact that, as we've gone to a more digital environment, our adversaries have found supply chain attack vectors as a way to cause cyber harm to critical functions that our businesses and the government execute. And so it starts with supply chain as a means for cyber attacks. But of course, we also have to deal with other risks associated with ICT supply chains, the availability of the core hardware and software and material that goes into creating that, so that we can continue to take advantage of economic growth and economic opportunity, economic competitiveness by moving to more efficient and effective operations of critical systems, making sure we have the ICT to allow us to do that. The pandemic put stress on our ICT, making sure that we have in the US confidence of the availability of the ICT, the ability to manufacture here, the ability to enter into trusted global partnerships. And then finally, of course, digitalization and the continuing evolution of digitalization has created new risk as we go to future generations of big data and communications and artificial intelligence and things like that, that ICT at the backbone of, that's great opportunity for the United States. That's great opportunity for our economy, but there will be new risks through the ongoing digital transformation. And so those three areas of risk, cyber means, digital transformation, and availability of core materials to put together ICT, energize the supply chain risk management imperative. And what we're trying to do for Taskforce in our, frankly, our theory in CISA is go after those risks through public-private collaboration, creating sort of a consensus-driven approach to pull from the authorities, the capabilities, the perspectives, the knowledge of both industry and across government to drive unified solutions to reduce risk to ICT supply chains. The particular tasks that we've talked about are ways that we're going at it. But our theory of the case of how we reduce risk to key areas in this country is we get the people from across industry and government together to go after that risk, because the risk is a shared risk. And the ICT Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force is I think, a proof of our theory of the case is an effective one, and I look forward to talking about.
Yeah, so thank you, Bob. So there's a lot there. I think all three of you had mentioned the pandemic and COVID. So Bob, as long as I have you, would you be able to talk a little bit about the COVID report that the ICT Supply Chain Task Force did in 2020?
Sure, happy to, Scott. So, go into the themes of what I was just talking about, and hearing the perspective of us all living through the pandemic, particularly the first couple months of the pandemic, where there was almost a near total shutdown of international commerce in some areas, supply chains froze in areas. We were all sort of, the government was working through what could move in terms of people moving, in terms of commodities moving, and had to because of the dangers associated with the spread of the pandemic, we had to take actions, and you saw governments around the world take actions to keep things within their border as much as possible. Obviously, a lot of what the IT and communications companies in this country who do business in this country rely on are materials that come from outside our borders, certainly materials that have to cross state lines. So what we tried to do as a task force, 6 months sort of after the onset of the pandemic in February, was take a look at what lessons did we learn about how well the ICT supply chains held up in a period where, because of global shock, we saw a shift. This conference is called Borderless, but it is not borderless in terms of the movement of material that helps us create, particularly hardware and chips and other things that are elements of communications. And so because of that, we want to take a look and see what the lessons were learned. We relied on the task force in the good auspices of Robert and John in their coalitions to gather information from major players in the ICT space. How did their supply chains perform during the pandemic? What lessons did they learn? And we saw, the simplest way to describe it, we surveyed a range of the task force members, and the consensus was, on a scale of 1 to 5, they did between 2 and 4, right? There were no supply chains that broke completely, such that business was sort of, ended up having a long-term impact, but there was certainly somewhere between the 2 and 4 impact on the scale of 5, that there were business impacts. There were some pretty scary moments, that there were needs to take some extraordinary actions to keep supply chains going. And we wanted to capture the companies that did better. Are there ways to better be prepared for the next time you have a similar sort of global shock like that? And so that's the analysis we did in terms of recommendations, pointed out areas of need for increased transparency into how supply chains work, increased resilience into availability of backup places to get supplies, worried about concentration risk of too much supplies coming from a certain company or certain country or certain region of the world. But it does come down to, and what we really emphasize in the report is more pre-planning and transparency, illumination to understand where you're getting things from, and then recognize with that knowledge, make sure that you've stress tested. And the companies that did that, the companies that had more insight, companies that had thought through stress testing of certain scenarios, big global shock scenarios, perform better. That takes money to invest in, but it also takes taking advantage of new technologies and tools. And we made a series of recommendations of ways that the companies can take steps in that direction.
So awesome. Thank you for that, Bob. And John, there were 2 other reports or another two other items from 2020 that we agreed we wanted to talk about. So one was the work around vendor attestation, and then there's some work on the executive order. So which one of those would you like to tackle?
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I mean, well, certainly, I think it is worth starting with the vendor attestation work. You know, and although the bulk, I will also point out, although the bulk of that work was completed in 2020, I believe it was just this spring that the final report was approved, and so I thought folks might be interested in hearing about that a little bit. You know, I mean, and there were really two resources that were published at the same time. I'll reference the other one too, because I think it's related, because the issue of, you know, assessing supplier or vendor security, assurance, trust is really a big issue, and it even ties into some of what Bob was saying earlier about suppliers and the need for supplier diversity. I think you know, there was a report on mitigating ICT supply chain risks with qualified bidder and manufacturer lists that we released earlier this year. That is a report that built upon existing industry standards and provides organizations with criteria and factors that can be used to inform their decisions to build or rely on qualified lists for the acquisition of ICT products and services. You know, and then there was something that we called the vendor supply chain risk management, you know, assurance template, which provides a set of questions regarding an ICT supplier or vendor's implementation and application of industry standards and best practices. The results generated by the template can then be used to help guide supply chain risk planning in a standardized way and to provide clarity for reporting and vetting of supplier processes. You know, I think that that these resources are important in that they are intended to serve as tools for IT or cybersecurity personnel, for acquisitions and procurement professionals, and for those who manage vendor and supplier lists. And you know, I think they're consistent with one of the kind of founding principles of the task force, which was that we wanted to actually create actionable tools and resources that could be used to improve upon and address some of the many supply chain risk management challenges that we see when we look at global ICT supply chains. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, John. And so, Robert, a couple other areas that we continue to work on the task force. So one is executive order implementations, and then the other one is information sharing, right? The information sharing working group. There's more and more interest on information sharing. There's a lot of attention within Congress on the topic as well, but the ICT supply chain task force has been looking at information sharing in this context as well. So what are your thoughts about both the work that the task force is doing in the information sharing, as well as in implementing some of these executive orders?
Yeah, so and I also want to get back at some point to the COVID piece as well. But on information sharing, look, this has been a term that is to some extent overly used, but it's certainly been a topic of great concern, going back to you know, the legislation that passed Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act in 2015. Bob, John, and I had an opportunity to testify 2 years ago before the House Homeland Security Committee on the topic of information sharing. And that was only after our first year of effort. We now are completing our second and a half year, 2.5 years of work products here. To be clear, when we're talking about information sharing in the context of supply chain, what it essentially comes down to is that a company, let's say company A, might be observing problems with a particular supplier where they suspect that there's a risk, a supply chain risk that's presented. Just to share with you the fact that, when we did the threat analysis, which we may also get to, we identified 250 different supply chain risks, and that was not exhaustive. So let's say company A finds some basis for discovering or suspecting that there's a problem with a particular product or service. They are going to be very careful about exposing themselves to a variety of federal, state actions. There's tort law, there's defamation, there's trade secrets, there's violation of contracts. There are a whole bunch of causes of action that can take place. And in the most recent report, what we've done is we call them considerations, and it's very complicated when you talk about information sharing. So it really cannot be stressed how careful you have to be if you want to craft in legislation liability protections that would allow company A to be comfortable with sharing information with company B, or for that matter, with a government entity. So what we've done in this project now is we've looked at all those causes of action. We've thought about what factors could mitigate your exposure. And we basically teed up the opportunity for folks in Congress to, as they consider drafting information sharing legislation and they develop language around liability protections, that they're fully aware of the kind of protections that are going to be required in this particular instance. It's different if you're talking about a cybersecurity indicator of compromise where there's clear evidence and you have the liability protections for that now in place. But when you're talking about a vendor and you have some suspicions about the vendor and you want to share that and validate that and confirm that, there's a whole different array of considerations. And that's what I think this work does. And it will be used, I believe, by industry as we have conversations with folks on the Hill who are considering information sharing legislation to help them understand how they have to think about the liability protection provision. If I can also, and the EOs are a whole other area, and maybe we can get into that separately, but I'd like to just for a moment go back to the supply chain COVID work and what the implications are of that. So one of the things that I think came out of that study is that there are embedded structural processes in place that complicate the situation when you're talking about a disruption like we had with COVID-19. So what do I mean by that? Industry over the course of decades developed inventories, just-in-time inventory mechanisms to basically create economic efficiencies. And during business as usual, times of normal operations, that works perfectly well and it becomes very efficient. Those systems are fully in place right now. There are IT systems that support that. There are analysts who support that, procurement people who support that process. All of a sudden, literally overnight, what you had was when the supply chain was disrupted in a very significant way, that system failed. And we are still paying the price for that. And all of the attention on chips, for example, which is part of the executive order inquiry, is really a function of not having sufficient buffer in place for disruption. And industries are making decisions, for example, without clarity on what their future requirements are. So for example, the automobile industry didn't anticipate that demand would ramp up that quickly for chips. And now everybody, they, and including the communication sector and others, are challenged with respect to that. The sole source, sole region considerations are going to be reflected in some of the analysis around the executive order, where there are national security implications around reliance and dependency, in many cases on countries that have been identified as our adversaries. That has to get resolved. And then I would say, importantly for our sector, and Bob mentioned the issue of transparency, we as the communication sector, when we deliver our services, we basically are dealing with finished products, which means there is a whole value chain that comes up to us from the commodities that might go into a particular piece of infrastructure, to the chips, to the circuit boards, to all of the elements that go into delivering that service. We can think that we have diversity in the supply chain because we may have 6 suppliers for a particular finished product, but without understanding, what's happening at the commodity level, what's happening at the chip level, at the circuit board level, and it's a visibility that is not clear to us in many instances. Our ability to assess supply chain risk becomes more complicated, and I think that is something that we're all going to be focusing our attention on as we move forward here, is to try to create as much transparency and visibility into the risks associated with the supply chain. And I'll let John maybe tee up the executive orders, because that's a whole other conversation, but they're all related. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. So I think we will turn to John here next, and then we'll go over to Bob and as a follow-up. So John.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, well, I mean, first, well, Robert is correct. I mean, it definitely, these things are all related. Just to also just add a couple of brief words on the COVID report specifically. I agree with what Robert said. I guess I would make one maybe a minor addendum to what Robert was talking about with respect to kind of just-in-time inventory models or lean inventory models generally. I mean, I do think that I guess I wouldn't say that model failed for all in industry, because I think that there really was quite some bit of variance, at least with respect to semiconductors, regarding how lean certain industries wanted to have their models, some as low as 8 or 12 weeks. But I know for a fact, at least elsewhere in the IT industry, you've got lots of companies who, because of the critical nature of semiconductors, would have a 52-week supply or something like that. So, I think one of the things coming out of the pandemic and out of that report is a reevaluation of, that whole just-in-time lean inventory model. So I totally agree with Robert on that, and clearly the whole issue of over reliance on single source or single region suppliers was really another key takeaway. I mean, it does dovetail exactly with one of the supply chain executive orders that we have seen come out of the Biden administration. Executive order back in February, the America's Supply Chain Executive Order, or what's the number there? I think 140117. Hard to keep these executive order numbers all in track. But I think as the pandemic showed, that the supply chain task force, in addition to the working group activities that we've already mentioned here, it's proven to be a valuable resource that can be deployed to kind of help out or to tackle specific issues or projects as they come up. COVID study was one example of that, and the work that we've done now on supply chains, executive orders from both the last administration and this administration is another example of that. The America's Supply Chain Executive Order, amongst other things, well, first of all, did call for a 100-day review of the semiconductor situation specifically, and that report has just been recently issued. But it also instructed the Commerce Department and the Department of Homeland Security and CISA specifically to conduct a comprehensive review of and submit a report, over a year of the supply chains for various critical sectors and subsectors, including those of the information and communications technology industrial base, as they're saying. So amongst other things, that assessment is supposed to include a review of critical goods and materials underlying the ICT supply chain, other essential goods and materials, and a few other factors, and Robert alluded to some of those. So the initial phase of work, during that initial phase of work, CISA actually asked for the task force's help. Robert was mentioning that there's visibility issues that the comm sector has. Once you start going a few layers deep in the supply chain, clearly the government has those same issues. So, I mean, it was really critical to get industry and IT and comm sector input into this early work. And the task force worked, I think, fairly well and rapidly on identifying some of those, supply chains that were maybe most at risk, or particularly from not only a security but a resiliency standpoint, and really trying to identify those essential ICT products, components, goods, materials, etc. So that work is ongoing. There's still a ways to go, but I think the task force has proven to be a very useful resource for our U.S. government partners, at least in the initial phases.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So obviously, COVID is lots of lessons learned, lots of work being implemented as a result of it. Executive order adding more activities for the task force. But I want to pivot, if I may, just to something that Bob talked about earlier, where he outlined these three risks that kind of scoping the work of the task force. Of course, a risk isn't the same thing as a threat. So the task force has been doing some work looking at the threats as well. So Bob, would you be willing to talk a little bit about some of the work the task force is doing to have a better understanding of the threats?
Yeah, so, and it does, Scott, pivot off sort of the pandemic piece, because what helped companies survive in the pandemic in their supply chains was planning. And so what we've done as a task force since the establishment of it is we've had a threat evaluation working group, which has really produced, I think, foundational documents to support supply chain risk managers doing planning. So if your risk is to take, if how you do risk management is to imagine the things that could go wrong, and then evaluate the degree to which those things would impact your business or your operations, the things that could go wrong are the threats, to use the important lexicon. And so, as Robert just noted, taking a whiteboard approach to all the theoretical threats to a supply chain from an adversary nation, from somebody exploiting bad manufacturing practices, from a pandemic or a breakdown of flow of commerce, from other business continuity shocks. We've evaluated 9 categories of threats along those lines, and we've identified scenarios by which those threats could manifest themselves in a way that something that matters to your business is exploited. And again, if risk is the availability, confidentiality, the availability of something in your system, or the confidentiality and integrity of that, these are threats that could threaten this. We published updates. We've published now 2 updates to that work. We've identified threats in the categories of hardware availability, software availability, and services availability. If I was running a supply chain risk management program, a document like this is where I start. Which of these threats apply to me? What rises at the top of my list? Can I bucket it into things that I'm most concerned of to manage the risk against? And that's how we're urging this work to be used. And then, the working group that's gone out of this work has then gone further and said, if these are the threats of concern, these are some areas where you might point to ways to mitigate those threats. These are standards that are out there. These are opportunities. So it serves as, I think, what can be a real essential job aid for supply chain risk managers to make sure that they're taking advantage of the wide swath of experience all the companies that we work with in the government agencies that we work with that have experience in identifying things that threaten supply chains and help establish your own risk portfolio or your risk profile. And so it eliminates blind spots. And I hope we can do things like this with a task force where the wisdom of the crowd, of the whole task force, can then be applied for particular people who don't participate in the task force to have more tools in their supply chain risk management kit.
Yeah. So Bob, real quick, where can people find this work? So where is it being published?
You forced me to remember URL, Scott.
No, I mean, is it the CISA website or?
Yeah, CISA.gov/ something like supply chain. I don't remember the exact post.
No, the point is,
but
go
it's
to
on
CISA.
CISA.gov, and let me use that as an opportunity to push that. pretty much everything we produced as a task force, if not everything, is available on this website. We have fundamentally, as a task force, thought of ourselves as 60 leaders in advancing the national supply chain risk management capability that represent big firms, small firms, associations, government agencies who have a role. But 60 or 300 people participate aren't everyone who needs to have this. And we want to make sure that the work we do is available to the wider community. That's a lot of focus we're doing in year 3, pushing out the word on what's available and how to pull it, starting to think about different ways that we can make this material more usable. So please go to our website. We're seeing great metrics in terms of downloading of the work of the task force. And that's when we know we're making a difference if people are finding it and using it.
Yeah, great, thank you. So John and Robert did posted a link, and they posted 2 separate links. So there must be good work all over the place. But please, people who are interested, please check out those links that are in the chat. The task force does publish its work, and it is really good work. I think one of the great aspects of the task force is that although you need to manage, you need to limit the number of people on a task force for managing reasons, right? You can't have everybody in the world on it. There are a lot of subject matter experts. It's not just a bunch of DC people thinking DC think DC people. It's people who have real world experience. They are professionals who are responsible for this and who are engaged in this effort. So that's great. So Robert, I think I'll turn it over to you, if you will, if you have anything you add to Bob's comments. If not, then if you can talk a little bit about the small and medium-sized businesses. I think there's a lot of these larger enterprises really have robust supply chain task force programs. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear that these small, medium-sized businesses don't have the resources that others do, and are key connectors into these larger enterprises. So what work is the task force doing to address that community?
So yeah, thanks, Scott. So let me just quickly, they're related, go back to something Bob said, which I think is a foundational point of the task force. He said at one point, in the context of threats, what does it mean to me as an organization? I think that the task force, through all of its projects, has been thinking about what can we do in terms of illuminating risk management in the supply chain for enterprises that they can use the material and it means something to them. And we're constantly going through that process of evaluating that. So whether it was looking at qualified bidder lists and qualified manufacturing, or looking at best practices that are embedded in the template in terms of how do you engage, how does the acquirer engage a supplier in terms of understanding the supply chain risk that's presented there. In all of these instances, it's an effort to help an organization, government entity, or industry gain some insights into how they can improve their supply chain risk management. When we started this program 3 years ago, I recall we had a conversation when we were identifying projects about the importance of not losing sight of the small and medium business community. And at the time, we kind of said, all right, we've got these big issue projects, information sharing and threat assessments, and qualified bidder lists and various other aspects of the big picture that we wanted to explore. But we never set out specifically to look at the requirements for SMBs. So this time around, when we finished year 2, for the first time, we actually created an SMB working group. And the leaders are people who represent, either through an association or some other affiliation, small businesses. The participants were mostly representing small and medium enterprises. And what they did was they undertook one of the working groups. We talked about the template that was created for helping an acquirer, for example, understand the risks and what questions should be asked of the supplier to gain insight. And they basically said, okay, this is something that if you're a big company and you have a whole supply chain team, you can do that, but a small company doesn't have that capability. So we looked at a few of the items, some use cases. For example, a company that might have a managed service provider helping with aspects of their IT functions, and we started framing what are the questions that fall within those use cases for this particular community. And it's different. When you talk about 250 threats, you've got to boil it down to what are the most critical threats they face, what can they conceivably be expected to do. Importantly, what are the responsibilities, for example, in the case of a managed service provider, what are the responsibilities of the MSP, what are the responsibilities for the company that is bringing them on, what are the shared responsibilities, how do you make that very clear and document that so there's no misunderstanding of who's responsible for what. Obviously, these things are very important in the context of large businesses, but with small businesses and medium-sized businesses, it was helpful to identify those aspects that can direct them in some of those activities. And I suspect, and then even in the work that we did, which we're probably not going to talk much about, but the IT managed service analysis that was done in response to the SolarWinds incident, which came also to the task force, very specifically thinking about what does it mean for a small enterprise, a medium enterprise, in terms of how do you protect yourselves against those kinds of threats. So I'm pretty convinced that going forward that we have done our best to now keep SMBs, front and center in our mind, because they really do have a set of challenges around resources that some of the global companies obviously don't face.
Yeah, Scott, can I just make a connection that, just a foot stomp on Robert?
For sure.
Make a
Yep,
connection
certainly.
to sort of the America's Supply Chain Executive Order and the conversation about what makes us stronger as a country in our supply chains. And one is a strong, small, medium-sized base where things are getting produced here in the United States, where the companies that we're talking about can rely on suppliers that are closer and work under our same legal framework. And so when we're talking about small and medium-sized business, it's not a theoretical, it's right. This is what makes us stronger as a country. This is what makes our supply chains more reliable. And if we can help those small businesses that do supply things have faith in their own supplies, that's really important. So what's really interesting about the policy space in this work in general is the merger between what makes America stronger from a competitive economy and what makes us more secure. And it's not an either or. We haven't talked a lot about acquisitions policy here, but obviously that's a big piece of it. But it is bringing in economic driven business decision making, security considerations into that, and thinking smartly about applying levers so that we have a stronger economy that gives us more national security.
Yeah, so Bob, thanks for raising that, right? That's a really good point. Yeah, so thank you for that. I mean, the economics and building a strong small, medium-sized businesses where we can provide some of these services internally, where we don't have to offshore them, where we build those capabilities here. That is, that's good for the economy as well. So John, I'm going to transition to you, sir. I'm sure you have thoughts on all these topics that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to kind of pick up where Bob left off. One of the things that at least I know ITI has been advocating for a while, because as mentioned earlier, we've seen really a lot of a high volume of supply chain policy activity, over the past few years, and one of the things I think the Biden administration should be commended on in terms of the approach that they have taken in the America's Supply Chain Executive Order is not to only look at the national security dimension of these supply chain issues or the cybersecurity dimension. Again, I'm not trying to minimize either of those very important considerations, but they did widen the aperture to also look at the impact, at impacts on resiliency. That's a lot of what we've been talking about really in the context of the pandemic and the COVID report we put out, but also other factors like economic competitiveness specifically. And those, driving policies that help address all of these issues as opposed to one or the other is, I think, what's really important from the perspective of many in industry. And to tie that back to the, to the important work that is dedicated right now to small and medium-sized businesses, I'm not sure exactly what the stats are off the top of my head, but I know it's something along the lines of, 90% or more of businesses in the US of contractors are small and medium-sized businesses, right? So that community and the importance of making sure we develop products that can reach that community, cannot be overstated, either from a security or an economic competitiveness standpoint. And that's why, although, as Robert pointed out, we had determined early on that we kind of want to always be thinking about the full array of companies and vendors and suppliers who are involved in the ICT supply chain. I think we really did collectively agree it was important to have a dedicated work stream, because that group does have a different set of considerations for sure, and those companies do. But also importantly, they clearly have a lot less resources than many other larger companies do. So we need to figure out a way to help them bridge that gap. And that's one of the things that the SMB working group's been focused on. Thanks.
Yeah, so thank you. So appreciate that. And also, though, is there a reality? Are we living in a world in which it's possible to produce everything here, or is it inevitable that we are going to have a global supply chain? I mean, we can't reverse time and go back to eliminate the global supply chain that we have today, can we?
No, I mean, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, there clearly has been a lot of discussion around the topic of, quote unquote, reshoring supply chains and things, like that. And as Bob mentioned, there is an economic and competitiveness angle to, manufacturing things in the United States for sure. But I think one of the frankly, in my view, productive approaches that the task force has taken, and I think we've seen this echoed in various policymaker statements too, on this issue, is that we're not just, we're not talking just about, we're not talking about U.S. products to the exclusion of all other products or vertically integrated supply chains in the United States. What we're talking about, I think correctly, and this is where some of the tools I mentioned earlier come in, is how do we build and ensure that we have trustworthy ICT supply chains? How do we ensure that we have trusted and trustworthy products and components, and resilient supply chains? And that is clearly, for a whole variety of reasons, going to involve the United States working with various international partners and allies to address these issues collectively. And frankly, I think companies are going to continue to have diverse, geographically diverse supply chains. But as again we pointed out earlier, we want to make sure we don't have too much concentration or over reliance on any one geography or country or company. Yeah,
very good, awesome, thank you. And then I think in the interest of time, we probably need to move on. We could talk more about this, the global supply chain, and we actually have a panel later in the conference on this as well. So, so we should move on here. We have roughly 12 minutes left. We just want to encourage people to put questions in the chat, and I'll get to them in a minute or two. So the product usage accelerator, right? That's another initiative from the task force. Robert, would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'll be happy to do that. Thanks. So, one of the conclusions, or even early thinking, was that we wanted to be careful that whatever we worked on and whatever we produced didn't become, I think, what sometimes is referred to as shelfware. We had a keen eye on making sure that we could produce products of value to the ICT and broader stakeholder community, the folks who rely on ICT products and services. So after the second year, after we had produced significant products in the areas that we've been talking about, we created a working group called the Product Usage Acceleration Working Group. Interesting term, but basically what it was designed to do was to make sure that we had mechanisms in place where folks who had an interest in this material would find it and be able to use it, and that we could explain it. And DHS, I think, has done a really great service in taking the suggestions from this group and helping push out the work product. There was in May of this year a toolkit that is on the websites that you can find that takes all the products and helps kind of push, explain the relevance to particular organizations. And I think that I don't have the latest numbers, Bob, but I remember recalling getting briefed on the number of website hits, the number of downloads. I think the downloads were at some point 15,000 or even more, over 30,000 web hits on the website. I mean, that is an indication, I think, that there's a demand signal here for us to continue to develop this work. The group basically looked at all of the products and decided this is how we're going to be able to promote this. This is how we're going to explain it. These are the people who could benefit from it. These are the channels that we're going to use to deliver it. And I would imagine that we will continue to embed that thinking going forward into all of our work products.
Yeah, super. Thank you. So any other comments on the accelerator? Okay, well then let's talk.
Yeah, if I could
about-
just, I'm
yeah.
sorry, I was slow off the draw getting off mute. Yeah, just to add one thing to what Robert said. I absolutely agree that I think we have significant evidence of the demand signal for the task force's products. I think also there is anecdotal evidence that there are still large parts of the community who maybe aren't fully aware of the existence of the task force products, right? I mean, I think all three of us participated in separate sessions at the RSA conference last month. And speaking at least for my session, these were practitioners, right? And people who are kind of on the front lines on supply chain and trying to figure out what standards or what have you to use. And there were 30 people in that session, and none of them had heard of the task force or our products, right? So we still have a lot of work to do on the promotion angle to again, as Robert said, ensure that what we are creating is not shelfware. I don't think it is, because we know there's a high degree of use and visibility, but there's still, again, when we think about the number of smaller and medium-sized companies out there, especially, there's a lot of people we need to reach still, I think.
Yeah, I think we have to up our marketing budget.
Yeah, so there is apparently there's funds on the way, right? So that's good news. So Bob, I was going to turn to you here, talk about the charter renewal and what's the next step with the group. What's the charter is expiring, I believe, and so what are the plans to keep the work going?
Yeah, so I'll take it a little broader, Scott, in the future of the task force. I think we as a task force, for all the reasons that we've all listed, have found, I like what John said, the preeminent public-private partnership working on these issues. And I think the members of the task force and certainly CISA and the US government have had value in the task force. And, we're fully expect to continue working as a task force post the expiration of our current charter. One of the things we're debating as leadership, or discussing as leadership, is what our priorities should be going forward if we extend the charter, and making sure that the priorities are aligned to areas where we think we can really make a difference at addressing the risk. We're in that process. One of the things I'm excited about is I get to have a new boss fairly soon when the Senate goes ahead and confirms Jen Easterly as the new director of CISA. And I've already talked to her about kind of some of the work of the task force. I know some of the other members have met with her, but I really want to hear her vision for where she thinks CISA can make the biggest difference in supply chain risk management. And we want to reflect that in how we shape the agenda of the task force going forward. And so that's one of the things. We didn't want to renew the charter until Jen arrives as our director, and she has an opportunity to really shape the direction of this. So we think it's, this is a thing that about supply chain risk management in general. So much of what is important is executive buy-in and support from the top at addressing these risk issues. And that starts in my case with my boss in our agency. And so I'm looking forward to seeing her thoughts in moving out to continue the work of the task force.
Yeah, awesome. So Robert, John, your thoughts about the future as well, not the task force, right? But also there's work in general. What are the next priorities, things we need to be focusing on?
I'll start and let John close. One thing I want to acknowledge is I think DHS has been really a helpful partner in thinking through the timing of these charters and how we move forward. So it was sometime last fall when we went to DHS and we said, look, we don't think we're prepared to sign on for 2 years. We know, for example, that irrespective of who wins the election, there's going to be a new secretary at DHS. There may be other changes in leadership. There may be a change in administration. We want to get the benefit of understanding kind of the policy priorities that might flow potentially from a new administration and new leadership in DHS. So we agreed to a 6-month extension. Recently, we have a draft of the charter. We're ready to sign it. We did all believe very strongly that we wanted to get some signal from Jen Easterly when she arrived, when she was confirmed, and now she is. And I think we're beginning to see that in some of the statements she's made. I expect there'll be even further clarity around that. Want to get a sense of what is important to the government in terms of their interests. And I think the foundational consideration right now that industry, I know we in the comm sector are thinking about the work that we engage in the partnership across any agency is, one, it's got to be threat-based and we have to really understand the nature of the threat. And two, we want to approach that threat from a risk management perspective. And I think the task force is perfectly suited to capture the threats and to think about the risk management strategies going forward. I think both sector coordinating councils are committed to continuing the effort in some way, but we also want to have assurances that we're not duplicating effort, that there's a clear need for a project, that we have a good understanding with folks, not only at DHS, but at the White House and in other venues, that the work we're doing there continues to be important and valuable, and that we can continue to frankly speak to our principals in industry and tell them it's worth it for us to be committing the kind of senior level resources we are to the projects. And I'm confident we're going to get there. Whether we get there by July 31st, I don't know. I understand we may have a little leeway, but I think we've established ourselves as being the preeminent venue, as John has described it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. John.
Yeah, I think on this issue of the charter extension, I think Robert and Bob have covered it well. I do think, just to put an even finer point on it, I think, as I stated at the outset, supply chain security has been for some time and continues to be identified as one of the very top, if not the top, issues, certainly from a kind of a cybersecurity supply chain security standpoint, that are facing companies globally. So there's definitely, I think there is definitely a will to continue to participate, provided that those, as Robert said, that we have, can identify projects that are not going to be duplicative of what's going on elsewhere, and that we can continue to kind of get buy-in on a risk-based, frankly, I'll throw it also, fact-based, coordinated approach to these issues. And so I think the reason that many wanted the reason underlying the short-term extension and why many wanted to wait till there was confirmations of leadership in the first place is just to make sure that there is that high level buy-in, because even larger companies are living in a world of limited resources, and people just want to make sure that if they're going to continue to devote the significant amount of resources that they have to this effort, and I'm sure that goes for the government partners as well, that we want to make sure that we're doing things that are going to matter, and so that's essentially why we are where we are, and still a holding pattern, if you will, but I think everything is pointed in the right direction.
Yeah, so John, thank you for that. So we're out of time. I do recognize there's a question or two in the chat. I'm clearly not the best moderator to get to those questions, so I apologize, but we are out of time for the session. I want to thank everyone for joining. Thank you, John, Robert, and Bob for joining us. I want to note that the conference is now will be in the lunch break, and restarting at 1 p.m. Eastern time. So please grab some lunch and rejoin us at 1 o'clock. So John, Robert, Bob, thank you all very much for joining not only this task force, but thank you all for the work, not only for the session, but thank you for the work you're doing with the task force and all of your various different hats that you all wear in your work here. So thank you very much. I wish everyone a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, everyone.